"How's the $5,000 a month going, Mom?" my son David asked with a half-smile, his arms around me for just a moment before pulling away. It was Christmas, and as always I had hoped for a warm, close gathering with my family. But instead the words felt like a slap, cold and unfeeling. I tried to smile back, but something inside me cracked, and the weight of it lingered in the air. This wasn't the holiday cheer I had been hoping for. David, my son, the one I had raised, the one I had sacrificed everything for, was now treating me like a bank account, a resource. I had given him my love, my time, my everything. And now all he saw was the check I signed every month. I'd spent years pouring my life into his, watching him grow into a successful man. But this moment was a harsh reminder that maybe, just maybe, I was nothing more than a line on his financial ledger. "It's going fine, David," I said, forcing the words out, my voice trembling ever so slightly. His eyes flickered, and for a second I thought I saw a hint of something, guilt perhaps. But no, it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced with the same practiced smile he always wore. As the night went on, I tried to push the feeling down. I told myself it was just a bad moment. Maybe I was overreacting. But the truth was, a part of me had already known. For years, I had suspected that my relationship with David had changed. It wasn't the deep connection we used to share. Slowly, without even realizing it, I had become an afterthought in his life. Sure, he still called, still asked how I was doing when it suited him. But the days of him coming to me for advice, for comfort, for a genuine conversation were long gone. And the holidays, the moments when I hoped for some sign that he still cared, only seemed to highlight the growing distance between us. It wasn't just the money, though. No, it was the way everything had shifted. David had become so wrapped up in his world, his business, his wife, his success, that he forgot about the woman who had been there for him through everything. The woman who had worked 2 jobs to make sure he never went without. The woman who had stayed up nights worrying, always making sure he was okay. "I'm doing well, Mom," David said, his voice pulling me back to the present. His words seemed hollow now. It wasn't the caring tone I used to hear, the tone that told me he still saw me as his mother. It was businesslike, detached. As I sat there, surrounded by expensive decorations and laughter that felt distant, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. My son wasn't the boy I once knew. He had become a man who saw me not as his mother, but as a financial asset, something to be managed. And as much as I hated to admit it, I had allowed it. For too long I had ignored the signs, the little moments where I felt like an outsider in my own family. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. I had given him everything. And yet, he was now giving me nothing but hollow words and empty gestures. The night dragged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently. Maybe it had been shifting for years, little by little, without me noticing. Maybe I had been so focused on holding everything together that I missed the truth. But tonight it was clear. David wasn't the same person anymore. And neither was I. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was no longer just his mother. I was just a name on a check. And at that moment, I knew things were never going to be the same again. It had been a few days since Christmas, and I still couldn't shake the unease from that evening. The house felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that hangs in the air like a heavy fog. I sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window, watching the bare trees sway in the cold wind. The warmth of the holiday had long faded, replaced with a bitter reality that I couldn't ignore anymore. I had spent years keeping everything together, making sure David had everything he needed, supporting him through his struggles, putting my life on hold to make sure his was perfect. But now it felt like I had become invisible to him. The person who had once needed me had changed. I thought back to the years when he was a child, the way he used to climb into my lap and tell me all about his day. Those were the moments that felt real, where the bond between mother and son was unbreakable. But somewhere along the way, that connection had been replaced by something else. I could see it clearly now. It wasn't just the money, it was the way he looked at me, the way his conversations were always about his business or his wife, never about how I was feeling or what I needed. He had become distant, and I had let it happen, hoping it was just a phase. But deep down I knew it wasn't. It was like he had been slowly pulling away from me, inch by inch, until all that was left was the money I gave him every month. The $5,000. That's all he saw me as now. He didn't see the woman who had spent her entire life making sure he was happy. He didn't see the years of late nights and early mornings, the sacrifices I made to give him the best life possible. No, to him I was just another source of income, a way to support his expensive tastes and growing wealth. And that thought stung more than I cared to admit. I had always known that David had changed, but I never wanted to believe it. I wanted to hold on to the image of the son who once adored me, the son who used to call me for advice, who used to spend hours with me just talking. But now, all I had was this cold, transactional relationship. I sighed, rubbing my temples, trying to push the thoughts away. I couldn't change him. I couldn't force him to care about me the way he once did. But what I could change was how I let him treat me. I had spent so much of my life accommodating his needs, but now it was time for me to stop. I wasn't just his ATM, his cash machine. I was his mother, and I deserved more than just a check every month. I needed something real, something genuine. But as I thought about confronting him, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What would I even say? How do you confront your own child about the way they've treated you? The thought of it terrified me. But deep down I knew it had to happen. I had spent too many years hiding my feelings, burying my hurt, thinking it would get better on its own. But it never did. Things never got better. They only got worse. I couldn't let it go on any longer. The problem was, David didn't know how to see me as anything other than a source of money. And I wasn't sure if I could change that. But one thing I knew for sure, something had to change. I couldn't live like this anymore. And I wasn't about to keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I took a deep breath, looking out the window once more. It was a cold winter's day, and I was finally ready to face the truth. I just hoped David was ready to hear it. It was a few days after the holiday, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The house was eerily quiet, as if the weight of the moment had shifted everything in it. David's words still echoed in my mind, and every time I thought of them, I felt a pit grow in my stomach. "How's the $5,000 a month going, Mom?" It wasn't just the words themselves but the way he said them. It was casual, as if he was asking about the weather or the latest news. But I knew it wasn't casual. It was a reminder. A reminder that I was no longer just his mother, the woman who raised him, but someone who existed only to fund his life. And as much as I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard the bitterness in his voice, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth was staring me in the face, and I couldn't escape it. It hurt more than I had anticipated, not because of the money, but because of the emotional distance between us. I had spent years nurturing David, making sure he had everything he needed, being there through every triumph and failure. But now it was clear he didn't need me the way he used to. I wasn't the woman who could console him after a hard day anymore. Now I was simply a provider, a source of income. I stood at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the bare trees. The wind was picking up and the sky looked gray and heavy, just like the weight in my chest. How did it all get to this point? When did he stop seeing me as his mother and start seeing me as his financial resource? I had always known that David was ambitious. His success was something I'd always been proud of, but somewhere along the way he had lost sight of what really mattered. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't about his career. It was about family, love, and respect. And I couldn't help but wonder if I had allowed him to drift too far away. He had changed, yes. But so had I. I had allowed myself to be put in a position where I wasn't seen for who I truly was. I was no longer the woman who had given up so much to give him everything he wanted. I was no longer the one he turned to for advice or support. I was simply a check to be cashed, a line item on his list of obligations. And that realization was both heartbreaking and empowering. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. It wasn't just about the money. It was the lack of warmth, the absence of care, the hollow words that had come from his mouth. It was as if he was already planning his next move, his next purchase, his next big step. And I was just the person who helped fund it. But even more than that, what hurt the most was the growing sense that he had forgotten everything I had done for him. He had forgotten the years I spent sacrificing my own happiness to make sure he had everything he needed. He had forgotten the sleepless nights, the countless sacrifices I had made so that he could have the life he wanted. And now I was just a source of cash to him. But it wasn't just him. Victoria, his wife, was no better. She had always been sweet on the surface, But there was something about her that I didn't trust. The way she smiled at me, the way she acted like everything was fine, it all felt like a facade. She too saw me as nothing more than an opportunity to live the life she wanted at my expense. And it was at that moment, as I stood there staring out the window, that I knew something had to change. I wasn't going to continue being treated like this, like I didn't matter. I had spent too many years letting it slide, convincing myself that things would get better. But they never did. I had been fooling myself for too long, and I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I wasn't just going to sit back and let David and Victoria continue to take advantage of me. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go on. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been complicit in my own misery. I had allowed them to treat me this way, to push me aside, to make me feel like I was less than I was. And now I was finally going to take control of my life. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about respect, about regaining my dignity. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. It was time to stand up for myself, to stop being invisible, to stop being nothing more than a bank account to my son and his wife. I didn't know how things would unfold, but I knew I wasn't going to sit back and take it anymore. The days that followed were a blur. The Christmas decorations still hung in the windows, their sparkle now feeling like a cruel reminder of the warmth that never really existed in this house anymore. I spent more time alone, watching the world go by from my kitchen window, waiting for something to change, for a sign that maybe, just maybe, things would go back to how they were. But deep down I knew they wouldn't. The realization hit me like a wave. David wasn't going to change. He had made his choice, and I was no longer the person he turned to for comfort or love. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was just another part of his life that he'd outgrown. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could he do this to me? How could he let it all slip away so easily? All those years, all that sacrifice for nothing. My mind kept going back to the times when he was a child, the way he used to look at me like I was the center of his world. I had been there for every scraped knee, every school play, every heartbreak. I had been his constant, the one person he could always rely on. But now he hardly seemed to care. I had given him everything, and now all I had left was a $5,000 check every month that he saw as a mere transaction. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about convenience, about maintaining his lavish lifestyle without ever stopping to think about how it was affecting me. I wanted to confront him, to demand an explanation, but the thought of it made my stomach turn. How do you confront your own son about the way he's treating you? How do you tell him that all those years of love and support were worth nothing in his eyes? It wasn't an easy question to answer, and as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure I had the strength to ask it. But something inside me was changing. I could feel it in my bones. I wasn't the same woman I had been just a few weeks ago. The woman who would have kept quiet. The woman who would have swallowed her pain and gone on pretending everything was fine. No, that woman was gone. I had to find my voice again. I had to stand up for myself, for the woman I used to be, the woman who deserved respect and love, not just a paycheck. The first step was simple. I stopped the $5,000 transfers. I didn't tell David, I didn't need to. I needed to take back control of my life, and that was the first thing I could do. For years I had let him use me as a safety net, but no more. No more would I be his personal ATM. I wasn't sure what would come next, but I knew this was the right thing to do. I wasn't just taking money away, I was taking back my dignity. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about reclaiming myself. I wasn't going to let him treat me like this anymore. I wasn't going to let anyone treat me like this. The first few days felt strange. I couldn't help but wonder if he would notice. Would he care? Or was this just another way of proving how little I meant to him? But as the days passed, I began to feel something else. Something I hadn't felt in a long time: empowerment. I was taking control of my life again, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was on the path to rediscovering who I truly was. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew there were still many conversations to be had. But in that moment I realized something important. I wasn't alone. I had myself, and that was enough. The days after I stopped the $5,000 transfers were oddly quiet. There were no immediate confrontations, no angry calls, but the tension was thick in the air. I could feel it every time I spoke to David, every time he visited or called. The subtle shift was undeniable, like a crack in the facade that we had built up over the years. It wasn't something he could ignore forever, and deep down I knew he was wondering what had changed. But I wasn't ready to face him yet. I wasn't ready to have that conversation. I wanted to see how far this would go, if he would notice, if he would care, or if he would just continue with his life like nothing had happened. And he did notice eventually. One evening I received a call from him, and I could tell by his voice that he was more on edge than usual. "Mom, I've been checking the account. The transfers stopped." "Why?" His tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't friendly either. It was more like he was confused, trying to figure out what I was doing. The thing is, I knew David. I knew him well enough to understand that he wasn't asking out of concern. He wasn't worried about me. No, he was trying to understand what had changed, what had made me stop. And in that moment I realized something important. He wasn't looking at me as a person. He wasn't concerned about my well-being. He was concerned about the money. I didn't answer right away. I could feel the weight of the silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment I just let it hang there. "Mom, are you there?" he asked, and I could tell he was starting to get impatient. That's when I realized he wasn't even thinking about how I felt. He was just focused on his own needs, his own life. "I'm here, David," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And I stopped the transfers because it's time for a change. I've been giving you that money for years and it's not working anymore. I'm not going to be your ATM." The words felt good to say, but there was a part of me that wondered if he even heard them, if he was even capable of hearing them. There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice was cold. "I don't understand, Mom. You're making a big deal out of this. I'm just trying to help. You've always said you wanted to be independent. I'm just trying to make sure you're okay." It hit me then. He wasn't even seeing me anymore. He wasn't seeing the woman who had been there for him, the woman who had given up everything to make sure he had a good life. He was seeing an obligation, a responsibility, someone he had to deal with. It wasn't love. It wasn't care. It was duty, and it hurt more than I had imagined. "I'm fine, David," I said, my voice almost a whisper now. "I've been more than fine for a long time. It's just that I've spent my whole life putting you first, and now it's time for me to put myself first." There was silence again, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. I could hear him trying to figure out how to spin this, how to get me to go back to the way things were. But I wasn't going to do that. Not anymore. "Mom, I'm just trying to help," he said again. But this time his words felt emptier. I knew he didn't mean it. He wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to keep things the way they had always been, comfortable for him but suffocating for me. I felt a small spark of defiance inside me. "I know what you're trying to do, David," I said, my voice growing stronger. "But I'm not going to be a part of your life just because it's convenient for you. I deserve more than that." I could feel him on the other end of the line, his frustration building. But I didn't care. I had made my choice and I wasn't going to back down. "I'll talk to you later," he said finally, his voice tight. "Fine," I replied, and then the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence fill the space around me. I wasn't sure what would happen next. Maybe David would fight me. Maybe he'd try to guilt-trip me into going back to the way things were. But I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. I had spent too many years letting him take control of my life, and I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. I was going to reclaim my life, my independence, and my dignity. No more living in the shadows of his success. No more being just the bank that funded his dreams. I had dreams of my own, and it was time I started living for them. The days following my conversation with David were filled with a quiet intensity. The house, which had once been filled with the sounds of family, now felt like a hollow shell. I couldn't help but wonder if David even realized what he was doing, if he even cared enough to notice the shift. But part of me knew he didn't. He was too wrapped up in his own world, too focused on his own success to think about the woman who had once been his entire world. I wasn't angry anymore. No, anger had passed. What I felt now was something deeper, something more painful. It was the weight of realization, the feeling that my entire life had been spent trying to build something for him, and in the end it was nothing but a house of cards. I had always put him first, always sacrificed my own happiness to make sure he was taken care of. And for what? So he could look at me with cold indifference and treat me like a means to an end? So he could give me a hug and ask, "How's the $5,000 a month going, Mom?" And think that was enough? The truth was I had been living in denial for far too long. I had convinced myself that things would get better, that David would come around, that one day he would remember who I was, the woman who had given up so much for him. But he hadn't. And the longer I stayed in that fantasy, the more I lost of myself. I knew I had to stop waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to change David, but I could change myself. For the first time in years, I felt the urge to live for me. It wasn't selfish. It wasn't wrong. It was what I deserved. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do. The money was the easy part. Stopping the transfers was the first step, but I knew I had to do more. I had to reclaim my independence, to take back the life that I had put on hold for so long. But the harder part was the emotional work. I had to let go of the guilt, the constant feeling that I was supposed to sacrifice for my son. I had to let go of the belief that my worth was tied to how much I gave him. I wasn't just a caretaker. I was a person with dreams, desires, and needs of my own. For the first time in ages, I started to focus on myself. I took walks every morning, something I hadn't done in years. I started reading books I had put aside, doing things that made me feel whole again. It wasn't about escaping, it was about reconnecting with who I was before all the years of giving. And then one day David called again. This time his tone was different. It was more urgent, more frantic. "Mom, why did you stop the transfers? What's going on?" I could hear the confusion in his voice, and I felt a pang of guilt. But then I reminded myself, I wasn't doing this to punish him. I was doing it for me. "David, I've made some changes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've realized that I've been living for you, and it's time for me to live for myself." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, it was with a tone I hadn't heard before. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why now? Why this?" I thought about how to respond, how to explain something I wasn't sure I fully understood myself. "Because I've spent too long letting you use me," I said finally. "I've been living my life for you, David, and I'm done. I deserve more than being a line on a spreadsheet. I deserve respect. I deserve love. Not just money." For a moment he was quiet, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. "I didn't know you felt that way," he said, almost sounding apologetic. But the apology felt hollow, like a temporary fix to a much deeper issue. "I know," I replied softly. "And maybe that's my fault. But it's not anymore." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I'll think about it," he said, and I knew that was the end of the conversation. I didn't expect him to understand, not right away. But I was okay with that. I didn't need him to understand anymore. I just needed to be true to myself. And for the first time in years I felt free. The days passed, and the weight of that conversation with David hung heavily in the air. The silence between us grew, stretching like a chasm I wasn't sure how to cross. He had promised to think about it, but I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. People don't change overnight, especially not when they've been used to living a certain way for so long. Still, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope, a flicker of light at the end of a long tunnel. It was the first time in years that I had spoken up for myself, that I had stopped being invisible in my own life. For so long I had been everything to him. But somewhere along the way I had lost myself in the process. I had poured all my energy into making sure he was happy, into supporting his dreams and ambitions, but what about mine? When did I stop dreaming for myself? I had always told myself that being a mother meant putting my children first, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness. But somewhere between the late-night phone calls, the checks I wrote, the hours I spent worrying about him, I had forgotten what it felt like to live for me. That was changing now. Slowly but surely I was starting to rebuild my life. I didn't need David's approval to be happy. I didn't need him to validate me. I was starting to feel alive again, and it felt good. It wasn't about revenge or anger anymore. It was about finding my own peace, my own sense of purpose. I was starting to realize that I didn't need him to fill the void inside of me. I could fill it myself. The more I focused on myself, the clearer it became that I was no longer willing to let my worth be defined by how much I gave to others. I had given enough. Now it was time to focus on what I wanted, what I needed. I began to do things for myself that I hadn't done in years. I started reading books I had put aside. I signed up for a painting class, something I had always wanted to do. It wasn't about running away from the problems I had with David. It was about rediscovering who I was when I wasn't just his mother, his ATM, his caretaker. I was Jennifer Ward, and I deserved to live for myself. But the distance between David and I didn't go unnoticed. There were times when I saw his name on my phone, and I would hesitate before answering. It wasn't because I didn't want to speak to him. It was because I wasn't sure what to say anymore. The conversations we had were always strained, awkward, like we were both walking on eggshells around each other. I wasn't sure what he expected from me. I wasn't sure if he thought that things could go back to the way they were. But I wasn't going to go back. I wasn't going to be the person I had been. One day, as I sat in the small cafe down the street from my house, sipping a cup of coffee, I realized something. I didn't need closure from David. I didn't need an apology. What I needed was to accept that we had both changed, and that was okay. It didn't make me sad anymore. It didn't make me angry. It made me free. I was free to live my life on my own terms, to stop being held back by the expectations of others. I wasn't going to wait for David to come around. I wasn't going to wait for him to realize how much I had given him. I had already given everything I could, and now it was time for me to live for me. And that was enough. Weeks passed, and the silence between David and me became the new normal. He would call occasionally, his voice still tinged with confusion, but each time I felt more distant, more detached. There was no anger left in me, no frustration, just a deep sense of resignation that this was the way things were now. I had done what I needed to do. I had taken my stand. But as time went on, something started to shift within me. The loneliness that had followed me around like a shadow didn't feel as heavy anymore. I had reclaimed my life piece by piece, day by day. The house, once so full of the noise of family, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could finally hear my own thoughts without the weight of everyone else's expectations pressing down on me. I started doing things I hadn't done in years. Simple things like walking through the park, picking up a hobby, or just enjoying my own company. I was finding a rhythm again, a peace I hadn't felt in decades. And then one day David showed up at my door. It wasn't planned. He didn't call first, didn't send a text. He just showed up. At first I wasn't sure what to say. My first instinct was to close the door to keep him out. But I didn't. I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment, and then slowly I opened the door. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He was standing there looking like the son I once knew. But there was something else in his eyes now. Guilt maybe. Or was it fear? I wasn't sure. But for the first time it felt like he wasn't just looking at me as a source of money, as a function in his life. He looked vulnerable. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, his eyes not meeting mine. "And I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I'd taken you for granted. I've been so focused on myself I didn't see you, the real you. And I get it now." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time preparing for this moment, anticipating his apology, imagining how I would respond. But now that it was happening, I wasn't sure how to react. Part of me wanted to accept it, to forgive him, to let the past go. But another part of me knew that I couldn't just brush aside everything that had happened. The years of sacrifice, the countless times I had been ignored, the way he had treated me like a financial obligation. I had come too far to let it all slide now. "David," I said, my voice steady but firm, "I appreciate your apology. But it's going to take more than just words to fix this. I need more than just a sorry. I need respect. I need to know that you see me, not just as your mother, but as a person who deserves to be treated with love and dignity." He nodded slowly, his expression softening. I could see that he was truly trying to understand, trying to make things right. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm going to show you. I'll prove it to you. I've been selfish for too long, and I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you." I wasn't sure if I believed him, if this was just another attempt to make things better without really changing. But something about the sincerity in his voice made me pause. Maybe he wasn't fully there yet, but maybe, just maybe, this was a start. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. "We'll see," I replied, my voice calm but unwavering. "Actions speak louder than words, David." And as he stood there, looking at me with what seemed like a mixture of regret and hope, I realized something important. I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing this for me. I wasn't going to allow him to control my happiness, my peace. And I wasn't going to let my worth be defined by anyone else, not even my own son. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be perfect. But it was mine to walk. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to walk it on my own terms. As the weeks passed, things began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. David had changed, but so had I. We still spoke, still checked in with each other. But there was a new understanding between us now. A quiet respect that hadn't been there before. I could tell that he was trying. He was making an effort not just with me but with the way he viewed our relationship. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it felt like the first step toward healing. I wasn't sure if it would last, if David would continue to change or if he would slip back into his old habits. But I knew one thing for sure. I had changed. I had found my voice and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my son, take that away from me again. It wasn't just about standing up to him anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for the woman I was, not just the role I played in someone else's life. It wasn't about forgiveness, though that would come in time. It was about reclaiming my life, my independence, and my sense of self-worth. One evening, David invited me to dinner. It was simple, just the two of us at a small, quiet restaurant in town. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I agreed. As we sat down, the weight of the past few months settled between us, but it didn't feel as heavy as it used to. We talked about the things that mattered, the things that we had both ignored for so long. We talked about the future, about how we could move forward. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. I wasn't expecting everything to be fixed overnight. I didn't need him to apologize over and over. I just needed him to show me that he understood, that he valued me not just as his mother but as a person. And in that moment I felt it. I felt the change in him, and more importantly, I felt the change in myself. I wasn't dependent on him for my happiness anymore. I wasn't waiting for him to come around. I had already come around to the realization that I was enough, with or without his validation. I didn't need to be the person I once was, the person who constantly gave without receiving. I was allowed to have boundaries. I was allowed to put myself first. After dinner, as we walked back to our cars, David looked at me with a quiet sincerity. "Thanks for giving me a chance, Mom," he said. His words were simple, but they carried weight. "I know I've messed up. I'm working on it." I nodded, not sure what else to say. He didn't need to explain himself anymore. I had already made peace with everything. "We'll see," I replied, my voice calm but steady. And as I got into my car and drove home, I realized that it didn't matter what happened next. I had found my own peace. I had learned that I didn't need anyone to complete me. I was whole on my own, and that was the most powerful thing I had learned through it all. The journey wasn't over, but it had led me to a place where I could stand on my own 2 feet again, no longer defined by anyone else's expectations. I was free.